Welcome back. In this set of lectures, I'm going to be talking through some ideas about environmental justice expressed in 3 texts that we're reading for this week. It's a fair bit of reading for this week. I wanted to give you some scaffolds in terms of stuff to focus on or pay attention to in the reading. So I wanted to go through them verbally alongside your reading of them this week. So Shrader-Frachette's 2002 book, Environmental Justice, is attempting to provide a kind of general theory of environmental justice and associated with that, environmental injustice. So she defines environmental injustice here early in the book in the following passage. She says it occurs whenever some individual or group bears disproportionate environmental risks, like those of hazardous waste dumps, or has unequal access to environmental goods, like clean air, or has less opportunity to participate in environmental decision-making. In every nation of the world, poor people and minorities face greater environmental risks, have less access to environmental goods, and have less ability to control the environmental insults imposed upon them. So what we have here is a distinction of 3 main kinds of environmental justice. These are disproportionate distribution of risks, unequal access to goods, and less opportunity in decision-making. All of these things having to do with the environment. So anytime one group or individual is subjected to more risks than others without there being some justification, or has less access to environmental goods than others without having some justification for that, or is less able to participate in environmental decision-making than others without there being some good justification for that, then we have a case of environmental injustice, as Shrader-Frachette has defined it. And in the introduction, Shrader-Frachette also notes a kind of misanthropy, which is a theme in a lot of traditional environmentalism. Misanthropy means basically hatred of humans or antagonism towards humans. And she gives 3, we saw that to some extent in the Earth First Manifesto. We saw that in maybe some things that were said in Deep Ecology about reducing population. And these aspects have already been criticized by Bookchin and Guha. But Shrader-Frachette just notes here that there may be 3 reasons for this misanthropy in traditional environmentalism. 2 of these have to do with the history of the environmental movements in the United States, in particular, that in the early 20th century, these were associated basically with wealthy people who had the ability to go out and enjoy nature because they weren't consumed with work and other things like that. So there's a kind of association of environmentalism with the elites, or with those who are in a very privileged class position. And likewise, there's an association of environmentalism with government forces and institutions, because a lot of the early environmental movements and environmental activist activities were conducted through government projects like the national park system and so on. And even someone like Leopold kind of exemplifies this association of traditional environmentalism with government forces. And then finally, there's this idea of a contrast or conflict between anthropocentrism and ecocentrism, which of course we saw play out in a lot of the philosophy in environmental ethics of the past 50 years. We read the pieces by Routley and by Rolston and others. And that sense of, and this also of course appears in Deep Ecology and Earth First. And this idea of a contrast between what's good for humans and what's good for nature as a kind of framework that thinkers keep going back to and keep wrestling with this question of, like, who do we choose when it comes down to a conflict between these humans or nature? That whole framework tends to construe humans as or tends to make it possible to construe humans as the enemies of the environment or the enemies of ecological concerns. And that can lead to a kind of misanthropy. In strong contrast to that tradition of misanthropy in environmentalism, Shrader-Frachette says, this book argues that protection for people and the planet go hand in hand. So she basically wants to articulate a position. We saw Guha do something similar here, and Bookchin also in his own way. She wants to articulate a position from which it's the case that protecting people and protecting the environment are engaging in the same kind of action or in closely related actions, that these things can be done together. And I just have as a question here whether this is a necessary association or a contingent association. That is, like, do we want to do both these things because we care about both these things, or do we want to do both these things because in order to do one we have to do the other? Those are two different kinds of claims. So just we'll raise that as a question of which of those two or something else Shrader-Frachette means by saying that these things go hand in hand. There are two aspects of justice that Shrader-Frachette says are relevant and that she wants to emphasize. And these have already been mentioned in the kind of three kinds of environmental injustice that were just described on the previous slide. One is what you could call distributive justice, justice about how goods and opportunities in society are distributed. And the other is justice about participation in decision-making processes. That is, who has a say in what happens. And so she just briefly summarizes this point by saying environmental justice requires both a more equitable distribution of environmental goods and bads and greater public participation in evaluating and apportioning these goods and bads.